One of the biggest surprises of the Nintendo Switch 2 launch has been revisiting The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker because I have not played this version of the game since the HD version came out. Every time I've come back to the game since then, I've been exclusively playing the Wii U version. I'm not sure how many times I played through it. I want to say like two or three, but that's been my default version of the game since that version came out. I've been playing the Wii U version over the GameCube version because of just being on like a modern piece of hardware, because of the quality of life changes, because of just being a new experience in general. It's really interesting going back to the GameCube version because even when the HD version first came out, people were talking about how the visual style was kind of different and how like certain features and aspects were cut out. There were things about the HD version that were kind of iffy for like hardcore fans. So it is definitely really interesting going back to the original and playing the game the way it was originally intended. Playing the GameCube version, up-res and HD on Switch 2. And in a lot of ways, some of the problems with the HD version still remain. You still can't use the Tingle Tuner. I don't know why they keep re-releasing these games without like incorporating all the features that were originally intended. But by and large, coming back to Wind Waker and experiencing it again, after such a long break, it really makes you realize just how spectacular this game actually is. Because over the past decade, I've been spending a lot of time playing through like PS2 classics and stuff that I didn't grow up playing. And I've come to realize, especially after playing all of the old Metal Gear Solid games, just how much better Nintendo games were at the time. Because I think one of the big prevailing narratives from that generation was that the GameCube was a failure, that nobody liked any of the games on it, that they were all massively disappointing for some reason or another. And it's kind of shocking, playing Wind Waker again and realizing that not only is that not true, Wind Waker is far and beyond like anything that like I have ever played on PlayStation 2. It has better visuals. It has a more well-versed story. It has better themes. It has better ideas. It has better mechanics. Like it is shocking playing this game and comparing it to something like Ocarina of Time and seeing how much the series has grown and evolved since the last generation of hardware. In a lot of ways, like Wind Waker is like the first modern Zelda because this is the one that broke away from the Ocarina of Time formula a little bit. This is the one that had a radical new visual direction. It has a new tone. Right. This is a very, very unique video game. This is a shining example of how Nintendo can completely radically change one of their core IPs and turn it into an iconic masterpiece in its own right. This is not the same as the original Zelda. This is not the same as A Link to the Past. This is not the same the same thing as Ocarina of Time. It is a completely new and original experience. And it's very interesting looking back on it and seeing just how many people like tried to tell you the opposite, that like all of those games are rehashes of each other, that Nintendo doesn't grow, evolve, or change, that all you do is collect three objects and then like see a plot twist and then you get three more objects. Like there is just no respect at all for like what Wind Waker set out to do. And it is very interesting, like looking at this game, with the power of hindsight and just seeing just how radically different it actually is from Ocarina. Just how much the series has grown and changed since that release. And it is for the best. I do think like Wind Waker's core problem, when you really get down to it, has nothing to do with the game itself, but rather the fact that Ocarina of Time was the best game ever made, that it was some huge, iconic, like major thing in gamer culture, still is to this day, and that Wind Waker had to like follow up on that. Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that both Wind Waker and Majora's Mask were both hugely controversial when they came out, because both of those games are the ones that came immediately after Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask on the same piece of hardware, Wind Waker on the next gen hardware. These games were seen as like massive disappointments for not living up to the standards that Ocarina of Time set, but both of them took massive deviations from the formula. They were massively experimental in their own ways. They did radically different things, and that was for the best. And when it came time for Twilight Princess to come out, which was very much, a game that was meant to recreate the magic and feeling of Ocarina of Time, when people tried to cry and say it was too much like Ocarina, actual fans who have been playing these games were quick to point out that like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask were completely different, and that something like Twilight Princess was warranted, and that was something that we needed, and at the time, and Twilight Princess went on to become the best-selling Zelda ever for a very long time, until Breath of the Wild came out. It's kind of remarkable, seeing what has happened in the past 20 years, because when Wind Waker came out, the community was absolute. They were certain that like the Zelda IP was on the way out. They really thought that, like trash PS2 IPs that like Metal Gear, Final Fantasy, Jack and Daxter, whatever, Dark Cloud, they were God of War, it was like common for like gamers to think that like the Zelda brand was on the way out and would not like continue to thrive, going forward. And a lot of them were blindsided by the success of Twilight Princess, blindsided by the success of Breath of the Wild. But, I was not surprised by that at all. Playing something like Wind Waker, playing something like Majora's Mask, you really understand just how ahead of the game Nintendo and its developers actually are. Playing Wind Waker and seeing just how diverse the environments are, how many things there are to do, how fun the game is to play, you really come away with this experience that, like, this is easily higher quality than all of the other games on all of the other platforms. It's not even a matter of like that being true at the time. There are games on like the PS360 and the PS4 that like Wind Waker still looks and plays better than. And I think that's the big major takeaway from Wind Waker, is that it does look better. This is like the major thing that I really do think like we really do need to emphasize, like, 20 years later, just how amazing and visually distinct the game actually is. Because like this game ran on a GameCube and yet looks more striking and more visually distinct than like anything that's coming out on modern hardware. I do think that is like a major example of just how realism in video games has been holding back the medium and has been like this huge boat anchor around, how games are reviewed and received. Because it really did feel like, in the 2000s, that the core mindset among general gamers was like graphics, that was the first thing anybody talked about, is that like realistic graphics. And if it didn't have realistic graphics, then the game wasn't worth talking about or playing. And Wind Waker was absolutely reviled for that reason. And you look at like other games around that period, Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear, like the opposite was true. You had mediocre games that were being propped up because they were allegedly more realistic than Wind Waker. And it's become really interesting over the past couple of years, as like these games that were cutting edge at the time have been topped and outdone by like other more realistic games, just how quickly they've fallen out of the popular zeitgeist. Like something like Oblivion will never have the long-standing appeal and relevancy that Zelda has had, in spite of its like attempts at being a realistic, quote unquote, fantasy RPG. Like when they tried to like promote like Oblivion earlier this year, Oblivion Remastered, and try and sell it as this like huge new thing. Like, Skyrim fans were shocked at just how clunky and unintuitive it was. I had the opposite experience with Wind Waker, where I was shocked at how well the game still looked and played. It was such a radically different experience where, like, having played like Breath of the Wild so much, Tears of the Kingdom so much, like I was kind of expecting like Wind Waker to be a lot more simplified. And to a certain extent, that is true. And like when it comes to the environment design and like the structure and stuff like that, the game. One of the things that really struck me about this on this playthrough is how short the game actually is. But like when it comes to like how well made the game is, when it comes to how fun it is to actually play, you come away with this feeling that like Wind Waker really is something special, because Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are an improvement on the formula. They have like way more in-depth systems and technologies and like things going on, but like Wind Waker has its simplicity. It has its vibe. It has like its really good like fast pace. You're going to be constantly be exploring all these really well developed, interesting, engaging areas. I think within 3 hours you'll have seen like Forsaken Fortress, Dragon Roost, and the Forest Haven, which are all like radically different environments that all radically feature their own ideas and themes, mechanics, and it's just so well implemented and so memorable. I was just kind of like, I was kind of shocked at how many times I was like playing this game and was like sharing stories about like, oh yeah, I remember when I saw this for the first time, or I remember doing this when I first got here. Maybe it's because I played the game when I was so young, but the reality of the situation is that the game is like extremely memorable. Growing up, we used to always, there were people like seriously complaining about like the Forsaken Fortress and like the rope test and things early on in the game. But the reality of the situation is that like that left a huge impact on us who have gotten through the game over the years. Like it's just an insanely memorable experience. Probably one of the GameCube's best, honestly. I'm definitely interested in seeing, as more and more GameCube games come out, like just how I'm gonna rank this stuff, because the GameCube has been like one of the Nintendo consoles I've played the least over the last decade. I've mostly been playing like a lot of N64 and Super Nintendo stuff. So coming back to GameCube has been a really interesting experience, because at this point, like I really don't know how I would rank like GameCube games. Because it's been a very long time since I played Super Smash Bros. Melee, which used to be one of my favorite games of all time. Games like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door are definitely games that like I don't love as much as I used to. And on the other end of the spectrum, Wind Waker, a game that like I always thought like never lived up to the original, the older Zelda games, has aged extraordinarily well. And I do think that's like its main quality. The thing that like just kind of shocks me about Wind Waker is just like, I don't know any other GameCube game that feels like it's aged as well as Wind Waker. Like Melee feels like it's aged, Kirby Air Ride feels like it aged, like Luigi's Mansion, Mario Sunshine, like all these games have like very real, like crippling problems. But like Wind Waker, like it feels like all the decisions they made with this one, like have led to the game being like kind of timeless in a way. I think like, people who go on to play this after playing Ocarina are going to be like downright shocked by just like the direction they went with the story. I think considering the game's age, I think a lot of aspects about the game that were common knowledge 20 years ago are no longer like major talking points among the community. Certain plot aspects like this not taking place in Hyrule, and like where Zelda is and things like that. Like that's not necessarily like the big major takeaway that's not exactly like common knowledge among younger players. So I'm curious if like younger people are going to like get into this and start like having these kind of like crazy experiences, you know, with the ending and stuff like that. It's definitely something to think about in that regard. Like how well is this game going to do among younger audiences? And considering this is like a Switch 2 launch game, technically speaking, being on NSO, I think it's not at all that unreasonable to assume that like after people play like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, that this very well may be the next Zelda game they play after that. You know, like, and considering this is the first time this version of the game has been re-released in 20 years, you know, a lot of these people are going to be playing this game for the first time. And I'm very, very interested in seeing if just this game ends up going on to get new younger fans, because I think out of all the Zelda games from that period, Ocarina, Majora's, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, I do think Wind Waker is the one that will have the most mainstream appeal. You know, I do think, considering like the way the industry is now, you know, because of just how overexposed like Ocarina and Majora's Mask are. I do think in a lot of ways Wind Waker is kind of an understated Zelda game at this point, and I wonder if that's going to lead to this game becoming more popular over time. And it remains to be seen, obviously, but I am very happy that this game has been re-released. I've been very much enjoying my playthrough of the game, and I really, really hope that all of you are enjoying it as well.